When talking about corruption, we need to contextualize its relevance. When we refer to corruption in ancient times, in civilizations that failed and washed away in rebellion or military defeat, or whatever else that happened, we accept it as having been a part of the failure. Of course it was corrupt. It failed. So when we come to talk about corruption in our times, in our societies, the context is different. We are still in a functioning state. It may be failing, but it hasn't failed per se. We might be up the creek without a paddle because we've been run into the ground, but we're still in our kayaks breathing air. But is that the state we want to maintain? Is this minimum of existence, access to oxygen, making ends meet, a pint at the pub, some fast food here and there, a season ticket, and then maybe a holiday if we're lucky, really all we want to achieve in life? If the answer is no, and invariably honest people would prefer a bit more, then we have to question why things are as they are, when they need not be. When we talk about corruption in a democracy that may be described as failing, then the conversation should shift towards making a change. The conversation should identify that people are in general disappointed and would like to find ways to improve their lot. This episode considers corruption through the disappointment of democracy. Two on the mic, clocking out. Enjoy.
Dung weche pek kod welo mabiro etu under mic. Dung parodit kod jok mawuoyo etu under mic. Seche tin sud buta wawinji etu under mic. Wala wachokre, wabed piny, biwawinje, ero chako, dumomit ndi, and a mic. Podcast makende.
We're often quoted Churchill's famous line regarding democracy as though that precludes any need for an in-depth debate. He said it. It sounds critically sincere and uncharacteristically sober. And if we all lived in an academic auditorium where the biggest danger of the day was losing the latest argument, then that's cool with me too. However, the vast majority of people have other pressing concerns. If we simply limit the argument to platforms, ideologies and systems, then we're guilty of excluding the very detail a democracy is meant to protect: its people. Platforms, ideologies and systems are vast machines, most often observable as single units. It is unlikely that someone would look at a bus and say, "Look at that 12-meter-long rectangular monstrosity on 6 wheels with 2 floors carrying lots of people that also happens to contain thousands of individual components and 13% of which can be charged electrically." Most people would say, "It's a bus." I would say, bus. When we look at countries, one of the things we talk about might be their political system, especially if there is something significant or controversial to say about them from our own politically motivated and biased perspectives. When we look at a Western democracy, we feel that about covers all the necessary bases. It's a democracy, so it's cool. It complies with certain standards, and so we don't need to go into it any deeper. It's like the bus. You get on, it goes, it takes you wherever you want to go. You get off, it's a bus. Oh, of course you have to pay your fee. In a democracy, in any system, there are components, hundreds or millions, or just a handful, depending on the component, or just one. A prime minister or a president, for example, Supreme Court justices, parliamentarians, cabinet ministers, opposition parties, civil servants, police, armed forces, lawyers, tax consultants, accountants, advisors, teachers, doctors, nurses, fire brigade, RNLI, and so on. Each of these groups can contain thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands. In each case, they have a hierarchy. Some of these hierarchies allow people to express themselves freely. Some of these hierarchies have codes upon which employment mutually prevent disclosure of sensitive information. As in, even in severe cases, it is at the beginning voluntary, because things are presumably worded in a certain way as to make absolute sense. I raise this point because in a democracy we talk about freedom of speech, yet even in a democracy it is understandable when speech is restricted. We all get it. But when laws are broken, are these agreements no longer applicable? That's a topic for another occasion. So, even within a democracy, there are circumstances when we expect speech to not be free. There are 30 human rights as per the UN Declaration on Human Rights. A link will be left in the podcast notes. Article 19 covers freedom of expression. Most, if not all, of these 30 rights are based on democratic ideals. They pertain to liberties, not liberalism. Some liberties, freedoms, are guaranteed, which we have come to expect in a democratic system. When we criticize countries for being authoritarian, it's usually on the basis of the freedoms they do not permit, but that which we usually take for granted in our own lives. Let's read a few out and see how we go. I've used short names for each as they can get quite long. Number 1, all human beings are free and equal. How democratic do you feel if you harbor racist or supremacist thoughts? So basically, if you're a racist, can you be a Democrat? Number 2, no discrimination. Okay, my comments, see above. The right to life, so therefore no death penalty, presumably. Number 4, no slavery. This perhaps needs more clarification. Economic slavery still exists in many Western democracies, and supply chains take advantage of slavery conditions in other countries. So maybe it has a limited application. No torture or inhuman treatment. Police brutality, anyone? The same right to use the law. We are all equal before the law? Right to be treated fairly by a court. This can depend on things. No unfair detainment. How long has Julian Assange been detained for without trial? Right to trial. Innocent until proved guilty, sometimes. Right to privacy. Freedom to movement and residence. I love this one. It means you can leave your country and go anywhere and also return to your original country. Right to asylum. Anywhere. I guess at least to those countries that are signatories, right? Okay. And it goes on. The last one, by the way, says that human rights cannot be taken away. Okay. Interesting. So when we look at these human rights, one of the things that becomes clear is that most democracies don't actually live up to these principles. It's true that they do some of them. Some countries may argue that they exercise all of them, just not necessarily completely. So why not? I mean, they've had time to incorporate these things. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights was established in 1948 after the horrors of the Holocaust. That makes it 76 years old. So what have our governments been doing all this time? In a democracy, the people are not simply a factor. They're not just a component. They are the base. The people are the authority. The people are the fundamental truth behind every question of reality. So why are so many of them poor? Why are so many voices silenced, marginalized, and ignored? Who decides such things in a democracy? How did we get here? Because let's not forget that in any standard definition of democracy, the rights of ethnic minorities are also protected. Democracies are vast units, like buses, that hide complex structures and components within. We currently look at countries in a political context and declare simplistically that France is a democracy, the UK is a democracy, Germany is a democracy, Canada is a democracy because that's what it says on the tin. Yet how many government policies do these countries run which the majority of people actually value? We are told that the strength of the economy is the biggest factor for people going into the 2024 US presidential elections. But if the political system in the world's richest country was even remotely fair, then most people would probably be more concerned about something else. The right wing in many European countries have strategically outplayed most neoliberal parties by making the discussion focus on refugees, the EU, and the suffering of indigenous communities, usually with emphasis on white populations. However, again I ask, if in the UK, a G7 country which claims to be so powerful, how come so many British people have to rely on food banks? In Germany it's the same. Germany has been a democracy since 1949. France and the UK were democracies long before then. The USA is not really sure anymore, but it was a democracy until quite recently and still is, depending on who you speak to and which program they watched last before you ask them. So why are there so many poor people in these supposedly powerful and successful countries? Where does all the money go? In a democracy, in a political system that places the people at the forefront, why are there so many people poor? There are other words in political science that may be more appropriate, but I'd argue that there is one which uniquely fits the current systems in many Western countries. Plutocracy. A plutocracy is defined as being a state or society governed by the wealthy. So why don't we call these democracies plutocracies? Well, I'd call that bad advertising. It's not likely to motivate people to do their best if they know from the beginning that they're actually just there to provide a financial benefit to the elites. Of course, there are some who rise up through the layers of poverty, and that's great. Yet imagine what society would be like if that rise didn't necessarily have to be so meteoric. Current systems employ millions of people below the living wage. There is no real need to do so. There is no need for so much wealth to be collected in so few pots. How much of those pots' wealth can be used effectively? If we eradicate extreme poverty in some parts of the world without destabilizing local customs and traditions, if we eradicate poverty in Western plutocracies, if we stop aggressive expansionist foreign policies, if we reverse centuries of corruption within political systems, we will be only beginning the process of shaping a future that may become livable. Is this fanciful? Absolutely. Is it impossible? Not at all. However, it would require people in governments to begin being fair, representative, and transparent regarding their motivations. I know this is naive, and it will be criticized as such. But huge social changes in the past were achieved because people latched on to naive dreams. More to the point, current social change strategies are largely aggressive and very hard to apply without causing mass disruption to living standards that will invariably affect poorer people a lot more than the elites, and that will affect the very nature of the change being undertaken. Non-violent, gradual, harmonious changes can be integrated into current systems to turn them away from plutocracies and towards democracies, perhaps for the first time. Looking at where humanity has been and where it's going, trying to make this change is actually a really good idea. And if someone says, well, that's just how it's always been, what's the point? All I can answer is that is exactly the kind of defeatist mentality which has allowed the elites to get richer and richer while everyone else has to find a way to muddle through. Peaceful transition sounds a lot better than a future of wars, uncertainty, and climate change.
Two, and a mic.
2 and a mic.